It will take years longer than Ottawa and Ontario expected for governments to earn back the public dollars invested in electric vehicle battery manufacturing. That's according to the parliamentary budget officer who analyzed the $28 billion of subsidies promised to Volkswagen and Stellantis. The report says the break-even point is 20 years, not the 5 years that Ottawa originally predicted. But the report only looked at revenues generated by battery manufacturing, and the federal government argues the PBO analysis is too narrow in scope. Joining me now is Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux. Mr. Giroux, good to see you again.
My pleasure.
So help me understand the gap here. Your report says that these investments will break even over 20 years, while the governments of Ontario and Canada said this will start paying back taxpayers in less than 5, or 5 at the max. How do we have such a big difference?
We have such a big difference because the governments of Ontario and Canada looked at a report that's called the Trillium Network Report, sorry. And in that report, they looked at the subsidies, and they assumed that these subsidies for Stellantis and Volkswagen battery plants will generate an entire ecosystem from the extraction of minerals that make their way into the battery and the battery cells and modules, up to the assembly of electric vehicles, as well as the recycling of all this material. So they assume that these subsidies in these two plants will generate a flurry of activity from these various elements. And electric vehicle assembly is the element where there is the most return on investment for the government of Canada in terms of tax revenues. So rather than assume all that will happen, we consider that the North American automobile sector is highly integrated with activity taking place in US, Canada, and Mexico. So what we did was look at only the fiscal impact of the economic activity generated by the subsidies at these two plants and the spillover effect, of course, but we did not assume or anticipate or make the leap of faith that there will be all these suppliers appearing in a short period of time.
Okay, so you looked strictly at the battery plants and the module plants and looked at the economic return those in isolation will deliver to the financial return those will deliver in isolation to the government of Canada.
There's a little bit more than that, so we assume there's some spillover effect, but the government statements also assume that none of the supplies will come from the US or Mexico, or that none or very few of the battery packs will make their way into US or Mexican-made cars.
Okay, so that's interesting because we've seen some of the pushback from Minister Fedeli in Ontario, Minister Champagne at the national level, Flavio Volpe from the Parts Manufacturers Association. They say you're looking at just a fraction of the benefits. The analysis does not capture the broader economic impact. Flavio Volpe says specifically it doesn't consider new vehicle assembly, subcomponent manufacturing, raw materials mining. Are they wrong in their defense of this?
The Trillium Network report itself states that in order for all these additional benefits, the benefits that they have optimistically mentioned in their reports, in order for that to happen, there needs to be additional subsidies in the range of billions of dollars for all these other suppliers to appear, and there will need to be government investment or spending on infrastructure to make all these pieces connect together and for all that trade to happen. So in the Trillium Network report itself, it's stated, pages I think 68 or 69 if ministers want to look at that, there will be billions of dollars in additional subsidies required for the benefits that the Trillium Network report mentions. So that's... Yeah.
Right, so you call that optimistic, but I wonder, is it unrealistic? Because we have seen investments in, say, battery recycling in Kingston and other EV components, parts of the supply chain in Quebec, for instance, in recent weeks, and we know that some of the automakers have said, locking down these deals cement future operations in terms of part manufacturing or plant manufacturers. So are they unrealistic in their optimism, or do they have a point when they make this analysis?
I think it's optimistic is polite. I think unrealistic might be more appropriate because another assumption made in these return on investment that's less than 5 years, it also assumes that all the activity related to electric vehicles is incremental to what's already happening in auto manufacturing in Canada. So no displacement, no substitution effect. And we hear that there will be a substitution effect. Fewer combustion engines will be manufactured and sold, and they'll be replaced by electric vehicles. So it's a bit surprising to see that everything would be incremental. There wouldn't be a decline in activity for the traditional cars.
Right, but that substitution effect, I guess, this preserves the industry, is the argument in defense of it, right? Because the combustion engine is probably going away over the medium term, so there's value in this investment because it preserves that industry in the status quo.
Exactly, but that's not going to generate additional government revenues.
So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a lot of people seize on your reports and they use it to criticize the government. They say that the government misled taxpayers with their 5-year horizon. Is that a fair characterization of your findings?
Well, I think people can look at our findings and compare that to the assumptions that went into the government's statements. Whether the government misled or not, people can make their own judgment on that. But a question that I think is warranted is this the best use of $28.8 billion to provide subsidies for 2 plants for batteries that go into electric vehicles?
Right, but these are production subsidies, so these batteries have to be made and they have to be sold before the subsidy is delivered. Yes. So the exposure here for the taxpayers would be limited by the nature that these need to be built, these need to be sold, these need to go into an electric car. So what's the actual downside risk here for Canadians with this investment?
Well, the downside risk is that the batteries get manufactured in Canada, the subsidies get paid, but the vehicles are sold elsewhere, and there's very little of the value chain, either mineral production or vehicle assembly, that takes place domestically. The source parts are from the US or Mexico, and the assembly takes place abroad. So we are just a battery manufacturing economy.
Well, what do you think the probability of that is when you look at the investments that have been made in the manufacturing plants? And the companies have said that these are part of their long-term plans and promising upgrades to do the electric vehicle manufacturing right here in Canada. I mean, what is the probability that we simply just become battery makers and not car makers anymore?
That's a good question. It's very difficult to assess the probability of that. If Canadian suppliers are already strong and have the knowledge and the know-how, the expertise to supply these types of products and services to car manufacturers, then maybe it would have happened anyways had the government not subsidized these plants. They would have supplied US battery plants, and the benefits would accrue to Canada anyways without the need to spend tens of billions of dollars. So it's a case where it's difficult to assess what would have happened without subsidies. Would Canadian suppliers be strong enough to supply US or Mexican battery plants? I think some of them clearly would, but will that happen? We'll see.
But, you know, this is a cornerstone, just as a final point, it's kind of a cornerstone of the industrial policy of this government, right, in terms of locking down key parts of a key industry for the next series of decades. It sounds like you don't think they've made a good bet here or made a good investment here.
20-year payback is better than what we have seen in many other files. If you look at Trans Mountain Pipeline, it's expected to be a loss-making proposition. So it's better than other aspects. But beyond numbers, there are other objectives than making money. When the government provides funding to corporations, it may want to establish, as you said, the cornerstone of a new or a developing sector. And that's why we have elected decision makers. They are in a position to make these trade-offs and make these decisions. And it's not like cold-hearted economists like me who make these decisions.
Right, so if the spin-offs hit, it probably works out. But right now you're saying there's no real certainty that the knock-on effects will actually materialize as they hope.
Well, not to the extent that government ministers have been making.
Okay. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Innovation Minister François-Philippe Champagne has just answered questions about this report at the Liberal caucus meeting in London. He says the PBO didn't consider the full scope of economic returns.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer himself says, I'm only considering 8.6% of the impact. So clearly, if you look at the rest of it, which is the vast majority, you come to a different number, you come to a much shorter payback.